Welcome to the event, Reducing Incarceration, Endless Punishment, Long-Term Sentences, and Aging in Prison, or for the alternative, Release and Reentry. I'm Samuel Roberts. I'm a professor of Socio-Medical Sciences here at the Mailman School of Public Health. I'm also a professor of history at the Arts and Sciences campus about 50 blocks south of here. I'm also the policy director of the newly inaugurated Justice Initiative here at Columbia University. And in that function and in that capacity, I would like to welcome all of you to what will be an extraordinary event and a continuation of activity and the acceleration of this activity in addressing one of the country's most urgent problems in criminal justice, the issue of aging and as it affects people behind bars and after release. At this moment, even as New York State appears to be reducing its rates of incarceration, the proportion of people behind bars over the age of 50 is actually increasing. Excuse me. Ironically, these are elders for whom the rates of recidivism are quite low, which is, by the way, where we get our one of our mottos, which is, if the risk is low, let them go. If you see someone wearing this button, please ask them about the campaign attached to that. I'll tell you a bit more about it in a second. These are people who could be contributing to the communities from which they came and who could be doing so much more with us here at home. Today's four panels will describe the problem, the barriers to release, best practices in reentry, and some possible strategies for moving forward. It might be a good time at this moment for me to give you a few notes about the genesis of this event. It actually began about a year ago, from my understanding, with a campaign that was launched as the Release Aging People in Prison campaign, which is coordinated by Soros Justice Fellow Murtagh Farid, who I believe, is Farid here yet? Well, I hope he gets here soon, because he's definitely one of our panels here, and he's one of the organizers. I'm sure he's on the way. And his work and the campaign are based at and hosted by the Correctional Association of New York, and it's new, I gotta stop saying new, you've been there 3 years now, newish Executive Director Sophia Elijah, who will be giving us opening remarks in a matter of a couple of minutes. This was something that Farid and his other colleagues began to work with, as I said, a year ago. And at the same time, here at Columbia University, we have started to form this Justice Initiative under the co-directorship of Geraldine Downey, who is not here today. She sends her regrets. And Kathy Boudin, who ought to be here because I just saw her a little while ago. Kathy, are you here? Raise your hand. There's Kathy. All right. And thus was a wonderful relationship born sometime around mid or late summer of last year. And we've been working frantically and enthusiastically to put together these four wonderful panels. I want to thank in advance everyone who is participating, and most especially all of you for registering. The emails have been coming in with your enthusiastic queries. The registration numbers have been incredibly impressive. And I have to say, I'm really excited for this, and I think all of us are as well. I should introduce members of the policy working group in the Justice Initiative. This is a group that's composed of people from Columbia, but mainly people that some of the Justice Initiative's partners outside of the university. Those include Kathy Boudin, who is at the Columbia School of Social Work. If you could just stand, please. Well, Kathy's already standing. Geraldine Downey, who I said is not here. Sophia Elijah, who is here. Murtagh Farid, who is here. Liz Gaynes, Tina Mashi, and myself. And then there are also members who included Ariane Davison, Victor Pate, Kalisha Perry, Sam Streed, Laura Whitehorn, and I'd also like to especially thank Cameron Rasmussen and Sky Ross. Cameron is the Associate Director for the initiative, and Sky has been our able and dedicated intern throughout this process, and they've both done an extraordinary job. Everything that goes right that you see today is because they've thought about it in advance and attended to it. So thank you very much to the two of you. Now, without further ado, let's go to our opening remarks. It's my pleasure to welcome back, I can't say welcome because Sophia, I think I've seen Sophia here on campus at least 2 or 3 times in the past few months. She's a regular here. It's my privilege to introduce J. Sophia Elijah, who, as I know her and as we all know her, has merged the best of brilliant organizational ability, pinpoint analytical insight, and an intellect and true dedication to social justice. And it's been my real pleasure to have worked with her. She's the executive director of the Correctional Association of New York. In that capacity, she is the first woman and the first person of color to lead the nearly 170-year-old organization, hard to believe, in its mission to create a fair and more humane criminal justice system. Ms. Elijah has dedicated her life to human rights and social activism and is a frequent presenter at national and international forums on criminal justice policy and human rights issues. An accomplished advocate, attorney, scholar, and educator, Sophia Elijah has practiced criminal and family law for more than 30 years. Prior to leading the Correctional Association, she served as deputy director and clinical instructor at the Criminal Justice Institute at Harvard Law School. Before moving to Harvard, she was a member of the faculty and director and supervising attorney of the Defender Clinic at the City University of New York School of Law here in New York City. Ms. Elijah also has worked as a supervising attorney at the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem, a staff attorney at the Juvenile Rights Division of the Legal Aid Society, and in private practice as well. It is my pleasure to bring to you Sophia Elijah for our opening remarks.
You know, the worst thing about hearing your bio is you start feeling older and older and older. Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you to everyone who worked so hard to put this event on. This is kind of a dream come true in a number of ways. One, to have this kind of attention drawn to an issue that is very dear to my heart, having had a number of clients who were repeatedly denied parole by the parole board, even though they were clearly eligible for parole and then ultimately die in prison. So to have a partnership with Columbia University and the Justice Initiative to focus on this issue that is getting more and more local and national attention is affirming. It's also a very important and exciting day for me because I will get to give my brief remarks before Brian Fischer, who usually is able to steal my script. So I want to welcome you, and I want to say that I could not be more proud of the fact that the Correctional Association is hosting the RAP campaign headed by Fareed. Fareed, well, you'll hear more about him later, but it's no small matter that he is heading this initiative, having himself been denied parole release over and over and over again. And I can't thank Laura Whitehorn and Kathy Boudin enough, and Annette Dickerson, who've all stepped up to work along with Fareed, because it's not the job of just one person. It is a collective effort. And that collective effort has expanded to incorporate what used to be known, some of you may remember the Drop the Rock campaign that used to be housed at the Correctional Association, what it has morphed into rap. So now the Drop the Rockers are focusing on the rappers. And then once we finish getting all the elderly people out of prison, we'll morph into something else, because ultimately we have to change the parole system, and I know most of you are aware of that. Recently, our mayor, de Blasio, talked about a tale of two cities, and he talked about class distinctions and differences and segregation and race segregation and two different worlds. Well, you know, the tale of two cities also applies itself to those who are behind the walls and those who are not. Those who are behind the walls live a very different and horrific life, and those on the other side of the wall far too often have no idea what's going on and what their daily reality is and the indignities with which they have to exist. Efforts like today's event give us an opportunity to close that gap, to close that gap of the tale of two cities and enable us to share with our neighbors, our families, and our friends exactly what is happening on the other side of the wall. The sooner we are able to make the other side of the wall common knowledge to those of us who aren't on the other side of the wall, we'll be able to make a real difference and start treating people as people and put people before prisons. We're going to start off this morning by watching a short video clip of a woman named Miss Rose Laborde, who you will learn has visited her son in upstate prisons for over 30 years. Miss Laborde is over 90 years old, and most of the times when she takes that long 7-hour bus ride, she takes that ride alone to visit her son. It's important for us to understand Miss Laborde's story because it shows you that the people who are incarcerated, they're not doing time alone. Their families are doing that time with them. And as they age behind bars, their family members and loved ones on this side of the wall are aging too. So with that introduction, I'll ask you to pay close attention to the words of Ms. Laborde because they're instructive and should frame our thoughts about what our intentions are and what our mandate should be when we leave the Mailman School of Public Health today. Thank you.
My name is Rose Laborde. I'm the mother of Abdul Majid, who is in Elmira prison. He's been incarcerated for over 30 years. Elmira is a long way. Takes approximately 5 to 6 hours to get there. You go on a van. We usually get the van at 1 o'clock in Jamaica, and we usually get there by 7 the next morning. Have to make a few stops on the way, but we don't stop for long. But it's very inconvenient. Well, for me, because I have shortness of breath due to congestive heart failure, so I very slow in walking and getting things done. But I go as often as I can.
Yeah.
A lot of people just don't have the means, and that's another thing. If you don't have money, it's pretty difficult, you know. Government got all the money, state got all the money, but people like me, I'm retired, Social Security, you know.
Yeah.
You don't have the money. You barely have the money to make the trip, you know, so. Until the last 3 or 4 months, we usually visit once a month. But he's having a problem with his back. He needs an operation, so he's not able to get to the visiting room. So he asks people not to come to visit. As soon as he has the operation, is able to get to the visiting room, I'll start my visits again. His youngest son, Daruba, his mother died when he was 14, so he lives with me since he was 14. And now he's approximately 23, and he's been working ever since he graduated from high school. Thank God I have no problems with him. He stays out of trouble and does what he can to help. He has visited up until the last few months. I guess he got a little tired, you know. So, but he's able to visit when he can. Because that's the only place he's ever seen his father was in jail. So, you know, over the years coming up, I guess it sort of got to him a little bit, you know. Well, the family has to go to him. He can't, you know. And as I say, everyone have children and they work. And it's difficult, but they go when they can. They go as often as they can, you know. But through the years, he has grandchildren now. And as I say, when they can get there, somebody takes them, they go. So there is no, you know, he has no family life except when we come to visit him. Because he's in there and we're out here. And we try to do as much as we can. They give you, forget what they call it, visits to stay overnight, like once or twice a year. I usually go and take some of the grandkids, you know, when I can. Because before, Daruba used to go with me. Now I try to take some of the grandkids so he can have a little time with them too, which he enjoys. The time goes by very quickly, of course. But any time is appreciated. You know? And outside of that, he sees his family when we can visit him. It would help a whole lot if he could be brought closer to the city. But of course, they're not interested in how I make it there, even though, you know, I'm 90 and I have a heart condition, and the local politician has written them and to try to get help, but nothing, you know. But everything or anything anyone can do to help, that's what's needed, really needed. Need people who are determined to see that some kind of justice is reached after all these years. So, I appreciate you taking the time to see what I had to say, because it is important that the people know just what's going on. So I thank you.
All right, if we could have our first panel join us at the front, Brian Fischer, Karen Murtagh, Will Bunting, Larry White, and our moderator, Liz Gaynes. And while they do that, I also wanted to mention that video was because Mrs. Laborde could not come to be with us today. That video was shot at her house by one of our interns, Ariane Davison. Ariane, could you raise your hand or stand, please? And just to show you the level of her dedication, when I asked her several months, actually I think it was only about 2 or 3 months ago, so how are you with a video camera? And I think her answer was no. As in, it wasn't a yes or no question, but just I've never used one. And she trained herself and worked with some folks and brought that really expert piece. So thank you so much, Ariane, for that. So now we will go to our first panel, Living Conditions for Aging and Elderly individuals inside prisons, and I will hand it over to our moderator, Liz Gaynes.
Good morning. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to do a lot of introducing, but you should read their bios. And I'm not sure what the order was in the book, but this is almost the order we're gonna go in. This is about the conditions inside. It's important, we're focusing on aging, and for at least this end, we would qualify as aging under any circumstance. So it's very important for me to point out that aging does not in itself mean illness. It does not mean infirmity. We elders do not need to be infantilized or thought of as unable to make decisions and contribute in many ways. So it's important to just sort of set a context of aging. For those young people here, you will do this too. So, but just that what we want to focus on now is that experience behind the walls, which is different. Also, we'll probably refer to a different way. Aging does not mean long-term incarceration, but many people who are in prison and aging are serving very long sentences. It doesn't translate to illness, but many older people in prison are dealing with medical issues. It definitely does not mean mental illness, although my own experience is that at least my children treat me as I am mentally ill, and I would imagine that goes far with others as well. So the way we're going to do this, I think all the panels, but for certain this one, is we're going to have actually very short presentations by each of the 4 panelists, like 5 or 6 minutes. Then I'm going to ask them some questions so that it's more interactive. And then for the last 15 minutes, you can ask them questions. So I want to start with, we're going to start with Larry, who I've known for a long time, to talk about his own experience, because I think you really have to set this up from the perspective of what it's like for people who've lived it. And that's where we're going to start. Larry White. Okay, I'm setting my stopwatch.
Good morning.
How to use one.
My name is Larry White. I'm organizer for the Hope Is for Life project. I'm the organizer for the Hope Lives for Life project at American Friends Service Committee. I'd like to, first of all, make some clarifying remarks about the title of this panel, Living Conditions. Living conditions in prison refers to more than just the prison, the physical prison setting. It also refers to the emotional and you still can't hear me? Can you turn this up in? How's that? A lot better? Okay. Living conditions in prison refers to more than just the physical prison setting. It also refers to the emotional and mental reactions to that prison setting. In addition, it also applies to the what I call situational circumstances, all right, that arrive out of serving time in a closed environment. For a person serving a long-term sentence, the prospect of aging in prison is a very complex one. First of all, let me set the standard here. The aged and elderly in our prison are come from 2 primary sources. They come into this prison system already aged and elderly, or they come into the prison system and age while they're doing their time. The rising number of aged and prison people in our prison system arises from the fact that they're serving long-term sentences, all right, and they spend an extended period of time on those sentences, and also they face constant denials by the parole board. The human and financial costs of long-term incarceration can be attributed to what we call the prison aging process. The prison aging process involves 3 segments of the prison population. People who are serving sentences of 15 years or more, before they're eligible for release. A segment of the population that is 55 years or older, and they're been classified as elderly, and the elderly prisoners who face infirmities of old age and require special care and treatment and are classified as geriatric. The prison aging process is a natural consequence of long-term sentences, constant parole denials, and what I call the rigors of prevailing prison conditions. The rigors of prevailing prison conditions has to do with the everyday stress and strain of being denied your freedom, being programmed as a number and spending decades without your autonomy. That has an effect, it has a decline. It has a physical and mental decline on a person over a period of time. Let's get straight to the chase. The prospect of aging in prison. A person comes into the prison system, as I did in my case. I came into the prison system in my 30s. I had a 25-year life sentence, and the prospect of getting released meant to say that I had to do 25 years before I was eligible for parole, for release from prison. During that period of time, the minimum part of my sentence, I was expected to show some change, some rehabilitation, some change in the propensity to commit the crimes for which I was sentenced. And so you go about that. The only possible ways that this is available for a person is by his program participation and by his behavior, by his good and positive behavior during the incarceration. So over the period of 25 years, that's what I did. I involved myself in all kinds of rehabilitative programs, and I watched my disciplinary behavior. My behavior was very positive and all. I went to the parole board, and I was denied by the parole board 4 times. Each time, the reason given was the seriousness of my crime. In fact, let me read you some of the reasons that were given. Time's over. Well, let me cut to the chase. It's those constant parole denials that tells the person that my opportunity for release before I become an aged person, which is 55 years of age. So I did 25 years, okay? And now I'm facing the fact that I'm going to be classified as an elderly person when I reach 55 years old. If I look around me and I look at all of my peers who have been to the parole board, and some of them have been denied 5, 6, 7, 8 times for 2 years each. So the prospects of me becoming a geriatric person, a person who will, because of infirmity, faces the prospect of being committed to what they call nursing homes in prison, euphemistically identified as units for the cognitively impaired, where terminal infirmity and death awaits.
So now Brian Fischer is no longer responsible for this. However, which I'm sure he'll be quick to point out, but he was retired less than a year ago as Commissioner of the New York State Department of Correctional Services. And now you have an opportunity with kind of set it up for us as well.
Yeah, I think from my point of view, I wanted to try and give a framework of who we're talking about, the numbers, and why it is so difficult to deal with both sides inside the prison system. And to piggyback, I know I am elderly, according to Liz, because I'm over 50. Historically, a lot of the research will argue, and I don't disagree with them, because I'll tell you some numbers in a minute, that when we talk about prison life and who is elderly, to use that in the broadest sense, is we're talking about people anywhere from the age of 50 and above. And the logic behind that from most medical people is that the individuals who come to prison, by and large, are probably about 10 years older medically than they are chronologically, based on the nature of their life experiences prior to coming to prison. Now, it changes a lot, but that's a good factor. So for the purpose of this discussion, let's use 50 as the beginning point of when we talk about aging population. And I do that for a couple of reasons. Right now, there are 9,200 prisoners over the age of 50. 2,500, and this is where it gets complicated from my side of the table, and when you talk about parole and releases and whatnot. Just keep in mind all these little factors that impact on decision making. Of the 9,200, 2,500 are in for violent crime. 2,300 are in for murder or attempted murder. And this has significant factor related to releases. When can someone be released? Overall, the over 50 population, and we're talking about our numbers now, 17% of the male population in prison today are over 50. 14.8% are female in today's prison system. What I found most concerning to me, when I did some research, in 2012, when we did another symposium, the largest percentage of inmates who die from medically related incidences are in the age of 51 to 60. 51 to 60 is when the onset of many medical issues develop and death occurs. That's about 13%. 13% were over 71. So we're talking about the onset of aging at 50 to 60 clearly is a medical time, if you would, maybe perhaps a time bomb, if you think about it. It's when medical issues develop, and clearly after 65, 70, we all know what happens then. The issue was that the deaths, well, numbers, 32 were between the ages of 51 and 60, 9, 61 to 70, and 11 were over 71 years. So that's the one side of it. The other issue that we need to consider as you move forward, especially on these initiatives, is who's coming into prison. And currently, about 10% of the males entering the system, regardless of their sentence, are over 50 years or older. 9% are the females, over 50, and it depends on how they're sentenced, but again, they're coming in at 50. If you use the criteria that they are chronologically, medically, a little older than 50 because of other problems, so you're talking about them coming in physically, 59, 60 years old. Another problem you've got, well, we all have, but the agency has an even bigger problem, and that is, what do you do with 119 individuals doing life without parole? There is no option. They will not be released. That's the law. Until the law gets changed, that's the law. So you've got a whole population that will be aging out and will be dying in prison. That's a fact, and we have to kind of come to terms with that. Complicating it all is that when an individual gets sick, he or she winds up in a regional medical unit. And unfortunately, we have over 300 in our regional medical units, and again, 78% of the people in our regional medical units are 50 years of age or over. 42% of that are 65 and over. So you almost see the progression. You come in at 50, you get sick, you wind up in a medical unit at 59, 60, 70. You concentrate it in these medical units. Complicating for all of us is the medical units are always associated with maximum security prisons, with the exception of Fischer. Medical costs. I know the economists will be talking soon. And it is I use the figure about $130,000 plus to keep someone who is medically compromised in a medical unit, regional medical unit. That's $130,000 per year, based on the fact that you've got staff, hospitalizations, medical people coming in. So we are talking a significant financial burden on everybody. On the other side, we in corrections, at least in New York particularly, our medical level is considered equal to community standards, whatever that is. But personally, my experience has been that the medical service provided to most of our inmate population is better than the general community gets when they use the hospitals as emergency treatments. I just want to raise two other issues for discussion as we go along. It was mentioned by Larry. We have 2 units for the mentally ill, the Alzheimer's people. There's no question about it. And we have a couple of units now for our terminally ill, and we have a hospice program that runs. So just remember now, we have individuals who are dying, who are terminally ill, who are in hospice units serviced by both staff and, more importantly, by other inmates who are trained to be hospice workers. And the last thing I want to raise is that historically, when the AIDS epidemic and the TB epidemic hit the prison system, the state did respond well, maybe late coming to the table, as Karen might say, but we did respond, and we did, I think, a very effective, important controls. That has not occurred with the aging population. I don't believe right now that the concept of the aging population and the problems it engenders has been totally discussed at the highest levels in the legislation and maybe even in the department. So people like you and this organization, that's important to start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Even if you are still saying we. Next, I'd like to hear from Will Bunting. He's an economist with the ACLU. I know what the ACLU is. I don't really understand economy, so please help us.
Okay, hello. So I was asked to speak about the cost of healthcare. So I'm going to read some prepared remarks, but just to put the remarks in context, yeah, so I work at the ACLU, and what we do is we try to get the government to do things that we think are sensible. And historically, when you think of the ACLU, you think of litigation. We sue the government to get them to change their policies. But more and more, another strategy that we're using is to work directly with legislators, legislators, to talk to them, to try to convince them that they should do X, Y, or Z. And one of the things that I was surprised to see is how many state legislators are actually small business owners. And one of the things that small business owners love are Excel spreadsheets. If you can show up there with numbers, it's like catnip for these guys. So what we're doing is we go and we say, you should do this because you're going to save a lot of money. And so that's kind of the strategy, and it's a particularly effective strategy nowadays, given the sort of state that many state budgets are kind of, the state of fiscal budgets at the moment. Okay, so now to the prepared remarks. So as part of an effort to increase the number of states in which there were laws allowing some form of conditional release for aging prisoners, we wrote a report. It was me and 2 other authors, and the question specifically considered in this report is, what is the expected fiscal impact on a state budget of a policy designed to grant conditional release to aging prisoners? Okay, so again, how much are you going to save if you adopt this policy being one wherein elderly prisoners can voluntarily choose to appear before a parole board, which I think the second panel will get into that more, and apply for release. So if you were to adopt this, how much money would you save? And sort of, I could just say, you save a lot of money, end of talk, but I'll say more. So when you do this, there's sort of 2 things you want to do. One, you want to say, okay, if you adopt our policy, what's going to happen? And there are 2 sort of costs that you would focus in on. One is public safety, kind of obviously. So, there aren't a lot of costs if you release these folks. And why is that? Well, there's sort of 2 things you would think about. You think about, well, what kind of is going to happen to public safety when you release aging prisoners? There's a lot of research that shows this. There's not really a great risk to public safety. That should be sort of obvious. The other sort of sadder state of affairs is actually the public, especially at the state level, the public welfare, the amount of money that they would actually spend on these prisoners once released is not so great. So it kind of put me in an odd situation where I would say, look, you're saving a lot of money, but part of the reason that you're saving a lot of money is because you just do not because of the current state of state welfare, that just states spend so little on welfare. It's really more at the federal government. So there's a little bit of a cost shifting that's going on. But on the flip side, you would say, okay, so if you do this, you save a lot of money. If you don't do this, you're going to spend a lot of money. And that's sort of what I want to very brief. And again, to cut to the short, what we estimated is that it costs about 2 times as much to house an aging prisoner as opposed to a non-aging prisoner. And there are a variety of reasons for this. As an initial matter, it is important to understand that this is not because aging prisoners enjoy superior levels of health care compared to the rest of the society. Most prison facilities offer only a constitutionally minimal level of care, meaning that state prisoners under the 8th Amendment cannot show deliberate indifference to serious medical needs of prisoners. And this sort of highlights kind of an institutional tension. When you start talking about the costs, cost, some people think, oh, well, what we need to do is we need to reduce these costs. That's not the takeaway. That's not the strategy. The strategy is to get people out of prison. I could conjure up all sorts of ghastly ways to reduce incarceration costs. That's not what we want. We want to reduce costs specifically by reducing the numbers of individuals presently incarcerated. So again, there are a number of reasons why a disproportionate share of prison health care is spent on aging prisoners. First, sort of obviously, aging prisoners are more likely to suffer from a variety of medical conditions. According to a government study, the percentage of all state prisoners who reported any type of medical condition increased dramatically with age. In Florida, for example, prisoners aged 50 and older accounted for a disproportionate share of all medical contacts, while only 11% of the total prison population was in this age. These prisoners constituted 38% of all medical contacts for hyperbetes, 44% for diabetes, 21% for asthma, 36% for general medicine. A second reason why these costs are high is that prisons are not really designed. It's an extremely poor place to house and care for people as they age. They were designed with younger prisoners in mind. They're architecturally designed. They're not really architecturally designed. I was sort of surprised by that. Even the amount of problems that can occur just dealing with someone who has a walker in a prison, it creates all sorts of kind of unanticipated problems, and sort of, I'm not going to have time to get into all, but thirdly, the staff is not really trained to deal with elderly prisoners necessarily, so they don't get the kind of specialized care that they need, and that's all that I can say right now.
Last but not least is Karen Murtagh from Prisoners Legal Services of New York, which is, unlike many of our organizations, the most self-explanatory name.
Good morning. For those of you who don't know what PLS is, we do provide legal services to state inmates. We were created after the Attica uprising to provide legal services on conditions of confinement. So we don't do any criminal law. It's all civil litigation. We used to sue Brian a lot, but now we...
And you won most of the time.
Now we have another defendant. But what I'd like to spend my time doing, because we've laid out, I think the other panelists have laid out the economic and the peniological issues associated with incarcerating the elderly. I will throw out, I'm not a statistician or an analyst, but nor am I good at math, but I had looked at this number of 50 and over, and it's about 9,200 right now in docs. And even if you take the figure that the Vera Institute came up with 2 years ago, that it's $60,000 a year to house an inmate, even if you use that figure, and it's more now, it costs more than $600 million a year to house the people 50 and over in New York State. So I think that's a number we should think about when we're talking about the cost. So let me get right into 5 case studies that I'd just like to share with you, and I'd like you to think about the economics, the peniological issue that the recidivism is so low, the moral issue about incarcerating our elderly, and whether it makes any common sense at all to do this in light of cases like these and hundreds more like them. The first example is Willie. I had to change the names. These are clients we currently represent. Willie was born in 1930, and he's now 84 years old. He is serving a 25 to life sentence for murder. He uses a wheelchair, which he steers with his feet because he has no use of his arms. He can't shave, comb his hair, hold a washcloth, or do any life functioning duties. His medical records total 495 pages and counting. He takes 36 pills a day. Due to his medical condition, he falls quite a bit. Most recently, he fell backwards while using the bathroom, hit his head on the toilet seat. Although he attempted to crawl out, he couldn't get up, and he lay there for 15 minutes before he was found by correctional staff. And then there's Adam. Adam's 75 years old. He's serving a 25 to life sentence for murder, kidnapping, and robbery. He's been in prison for 34 years. He's legally blind because 2 years ago, another inmate threw caustic chemicals in his face and blinded him. He has a host of other medical problems, high blood pressure, Hep C, but he also has what's called bilateral ankle instability, which causes him to fall, and it's very difficult for him to walk at all. He's had a number of serious falls, and now he has to get an epidural pain block once a month for his lower back pain. And just this past September, he was assaulted by another inmate where his right eye socket and jaw were broken, his right cheekbone was shattered, and he required reconstructive surgery. He also needed 15 staples in his head. His initial surgery left a hole in his palate, which causes liquid to spill out of his nostrils when he attempts to drink. Then we have Jay. He came to prison in 1977 at the age of 27 years old. 21 years later, in 1998, he was placed in solitary confinement because the administration thought he was a leader and that he might cause trouble in the prison. We filed litigation challenging that placement after he had been held there for 3 years, and it took us 5 years to settle the litigation. Docs finally agreed to release him and to pay him for all the time he had spent wrongfully in Ad Seg. We went to send him his settlement check, and it was returned to us, and we were notified that Jay had died suddenly of a heart attack, and he was 58 years old. And we have David. David is a 52-year-old African-American male. He served 23 years in prison for robbery, criminal possession of stolen property, and attempted weapons possession. He uses leg braces to ambulate, and due to various surgeries, has to constantly wear a catheter. He has an anxiety condition which causes him to scratch himself profusely, so his legs and arms are wrapped in gauze all the time so he will not bleed. Recently, he was given 18 months in solitary confinement for having contraband. The contraband was tobacco. And my last example is Charlie. He's a 67-year-old man serving a sentence of 15 to life for attempted murder, attempted robbery, kidnapping, and criminal possession of a weapon. He's been in prison for 22 years. He suffers from high blood pressure and epilepsy. He's completely paralyzed on the left side of his body. He's in a wheelchair, but he has no one assigned to be his wheelchair pusher, so he has to try to get himself through the snow up in western New York to get to the medical building, the cafeteria, the commissary, or the package room. Charlie recently fell out of his wheelchair and injured himself while having a seizure. So that's 5 of the 9,200 elderly that we incarcerate in New York's prisons. And I'd just like you to think about the economics, the penological goals, what we're doing as a society, and what we should do when we think about how to deal with our elderly prisoners. Thank you.
Oh. Those are grim, And I'm wondering, interestingly, prisoners are the only people in America who have a constitutional right to health care. I'm wondering, since we heard sort of multiple views, is there anything good happening in prison health care? Do you have any examples, any of you, of another way that could be more exemplary for how going forward? I know that, Karen, you're more likely to get cases that are, because they're for litigation, but Larry and Brian, I'm curious if there's some good news or some examples of how it could be. And one of the questions I have with respect to that, my children's father was in Virginia in a special prison for the elderly, handicapped, and victim-prone, which was a particularly safe, air-conditioned place where there was virtually no violence. As part of this, not just in terms of medical care, what you think about housing choices and whether people whether that would be part of how you'd want to treat the situation. Obviously, for all of us, the issue is much more about how to get people out, but as Brian points out, there are people who, at least in the current situation, are not getting out. So I think we really have to look at what is the situation in. Any of you?
I think it was raised a little bit on training. We spent a lot of time on the medical side getting physicians trained on cardiac stuff, AIDS, TB, all the traditional medical. We have not, and probably should talk about, we need to begin to train staff on both sides, both the medical as well as the correction officer, on geriatrics. And that's a whole other field that most people don't know about and kind of shy away from. And I think as the population grows, that's probably an area that could use some sensitivity training at the very least. As far as other conditions, we are working, or the state is working on an assisted living assignment, a building, if you would, next to another medical unit. But all that really does is prolong the time that we are providing services for them, not necessarily the level of service or whether or not they'll be released. I think from my point of view, I think what we were required to do, what the state is always required to do, is to provide whatever services they can and can afford, while other people, such as yourselves, trying to fight the good fight in terms of changing the laws or getting funding for new changes. And since I'm no longer the commissioner, I can say these things. I just happened to go back to the presentation in the movie about family visits. I believe in family visits a lot. I think the fact that we have too many children of incarcerated parents out in the community not seeing their families. We don't have enough family reunion programs. It wasn't very long a few years ago when we had to fight to keep that which we had. We attempted to expand family reunion, and in fact it was shot down, and then there was a real push to remove all the family union programs. So I think there is a time now where we have to acknowledge that we have other needs that have to be addressed, such as family, medical, aging, and those things, all of which are going to take a lot of push on the part of politicians.
I would say, after those very morbid stories, though, there are good places in docks in terms of medical care. The RMU, regional medical units, are fabulous, and if you're lucky enough to go there, you get excellent treatment. I think the problem is that, and I think Brian would agree with me, DOC's #1 mission is safety and security of the prison, and that trumps everything. And I think the culture has to change when you're talking both about juveniles, 16 and 17-year-olds that we keep incarcerated, and the elderly, and that the balance should shift from a punitive nature of prison to, for the juveniles, rehabilitation, and for the elderly, treatment. And until we make that culture shift, we're going to continue to have problems.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to say this, the way you framed the whole question, prisons weren't designed to be nursing homes or to take care of elderly people, you know. And when we talk about how we can make conditions better for the elderly in there, we're expanding the reach of what we mean when we say penology, you know. And that's a very dangerous thing, you know. It's not just that we're band-aiding a situation. We're dealing with a situation that shouldn't exist at all, you know. And so, you know, I don't know how we're going to get around the fact that the only way that we can deal with this situation is, first of all, you know, the sources of long-term sentences that we give out. We give out sentences that are much too long. And second of all, we have a release system, a parole board system that's utterly broken. You know what I mean? We keep people in prison on long-term sentences longer than they should be there. We extend that. There's no way of getting around that. Those are the two things that we have to face. You know, we can't talk about making things better for them inside or dealing with conditions inside to make it better for them. You know, I don't see any way around that.
Yeah, one thing I didn't say in my remarks, but sort of echoing that sentiment is just sort of a sense that, yeah, they're not designed, you know, to do this. Was when we looked at North Carolina, for example, we found that they spent about $18 million on aging prisoners, and about 72% of that was external health care. And it was just looking at the cost of that, it was remarkable to see just, like, so for example, every time you take an aging prisoner out of the facility, you have two correctional officers accompanying them. They're often getting paid overtime for this sort of service. And so I would just echo that point that this is not the right place to be providing this kind of health care.
So I want to, following up a little on that, when in, and believe me, for somebody like me to be focused on making prisons prettier, as rather than talking about how we move people out, is difficult. And at the same time, I'm wondering, you're mentioning taking people out. Recently, I was working with someone incarcerated at Fishkill in the RMU who had to go out, and the expense of having correction officers in the room was raised, and docs, I presume on their own, was able to provide a medical furlough, which meant that during the time he was out of the facility, he was furloughed, and therefore there was no need to have correction officers in the room, I presume because the person was immobile and there was very little security risk. I'm curious, within many of the solutions we're talking about are external to the department. What within the department's control can be done, and can medical furloughs, for example, be used more, and would that make some difference here?
Medical furloughs have been in the past used for individuals primarily on work release. I suspect that this individual, if he met the criteria, is probably, without knowing all the details, was probably within 2 years of his earliest release, which does qualify him slightly for consideration. But that could be expanded. It's a good point. When we have a patient in a hospital who is so bedridden that he's immobilized, is there really a need to have a correction officer standing by, or worse, have him handcuffed to the bed? The problem would be cultural change. Are we willing to take those risk levels? And that's really where it always comes down to while society might be willing to make those risk decisions, correction systems aren't. And we have to begin to say, why couldn't we give a medical furlough to a 75-year-old person who's in Columbia Presbyterian on basically probably terminally with cancer radiation? Where he or she going to go? That would require, again, legislative changes to allow, just like we did for the medical parole, expand the medical furlough role, if you would, for those cases that are not normally within a couple of years of release.
Well, I would just echo what Brian said, and he mentioned the family reunion program and how they wanted to expand it, and every year there's senators who attempt to pass legislation to completely abolish it, and that goes along the lines of anything else that DOCS wants to do progressively that might cost money. If our legislators do not allocate the money to do it, then their hands are tied. So I think it's our role as, the voting public to let our legislators know what we want done with our criminal justice system. And if we don't do that, then we're stuck with what we get. And all you have to do is go to the public protection hearings in January of every year, where the Assembly Ways and Means and the Senate Finance Committee hold hearings, and Docs always testifies. And I've seen Brian testify a number of times, and he's just grilled on everything progressive that he might want to do, including closing down a prison because they no longer need it. So the work really needs to be done on the ground.
Yeah, I think that, I don't want to get past this whole point about the length of sentences that we give out and why we give out such lengthy sentences. This is not the case. I mean, this is not a situation where we don't have examples of what I'm talking about. All we have to do is look at Norway, and the Swedes and Germany and all that. First of all, what this really boils down to is we give out much too much time, and we give out much too much time because the emphasis is on punishment rather than changing people's behavior. I mean, the highest academic scientists that we have in this country right here said consistently that punishment is the least effective way to change people's behavior. And if we keep on the track that we're doing now, we're not going to solve that aging problem. That aging problem is a natural consequence of the kind of sentences that we give out. We have to deal with that.
So, this is actually somewhat of a cynical view, perhaps, about people doing these long terms, but I got a letter yesterday, I get them all the time, from somebody with an 1980 number from Cooksaki. Why somebody's in a maximum security prison 36 years later is a whole other question, but I'm due to appear before the parole board, and as such, I need a letter of reasonable assurance to fit my needs if granted parole. I'm 83 years of age. I've been incarcerated for almost 36 years. I'm scheduled to appear before the parole board for the 13th time, and my health is failing, so I need a program to fit my needs. By profession, I'm a substance abuse counselor. I have 3 college degrees, which he names, and during my 36 years, I've worked as a chaplain's aide for almost 20 years, a counselor, a teacher, and other educational and theological programs. Do we depend on these guys to do this work in our prisons, and is there a reason why we have to depend on our long-termers and our people that have the time for education in order to keep our prisons running well?
That's the craziness that we have, the schizophrenia that we've got. We encourage inmates to get education. We encourage them to get training. We allow them to be workers, hospice, or whatever. And every system depends on inmates to help run the system. And then we say to them, do a good job. You'll get good credit for it. And in most cases, if it's an indeterminate sentence, the assumption is if you do well and you have all these degrees and work, that the parole's going to let you out. But they don't. And so the inmate then turns around to people like myself and go, but you said that if you do right by me, and I do right by you, I will get what I deserve. But I didn't get it. And now you begin to turn around good people into angry people. But that's the kind of cycle that we're in because we just haven't figured out a way of breaking that cycle. And I think Larry's making a good point. But unfortunately, in many cases, we sentence people because it's easy. See, I think that's really the issue. Our criminal justice system is designed to make it easy to remove people and out of sight, out of mind. And that's a whole nother kind of thinking we have to kind of change, the thinking about who should go to jail and how long.
I'm very glad to hear you make the kind of statements you made about yeah, I'm glad that you made those statements about the system. the implicit promise that is made in that sentence. You know, I mean, our system is so broken that it's really a lie. Our system is based on a system of lies. You know, when you go before the judge, you know, and I remember I went before the judge and he gave me a life sentence, and I was about ready to blow my top. He said, slow down, don't go off here. You see, I'm giving you a life sentence at the end, but I'm giving you a minimum sentence of 25 years. If you do what you're supposed to do in 25 years, you will go home. And it was on that promise that I said I seen some hope. When I went to the prison system says what they was told by the judge is true. If you do this within 25 years, and they laid out a regime for me to follow in 25 years, you know, when you go to parole board, you'll be released. All right. When I went to the parole board says, oh, we acknowledge, you know, your outstanding program advancements and your exceptional behavior. However, the seriousness of your crime says that it would be, incompatible to release you at this given time. And so there's a lie down here. Our system is supposed to be based upon interactions. You know, there's a sentencing scheme. And the sentencing scheme involves the courts, the prisons, and the parole system. The problem is not with the first two. The problem is with the parole board. The parole board does not keep track, does not keep forward the problem, the promise that was made. And so this has a great deal to do with recidivism and with crime when the person gets out. Because when the person gets out, so they lied to me. I can't depend on anything that the law says, because the law is a lie. They told me if I did what I was supposed to do, my minimum sentence, I go home. And here, I came out of jail. I came out of prison after doing 32 years. You know, I was into my 70s. You know, I'll be 80 this December. You know what I mean? And it's a lie. When I look at it, it's a lie. You know, and a lot of people say it's a lie, so I'm not paying any attention to the law. I do whatever I have to do to survive out here. And that's based on the system and lies of the system.
So I think it's time, or I'm certainly happy to make it time, to add questions from people here. Do you have are you going to mic them? Or if you stand up, someone will come to you with a microphone. Barbara?
Hi, I'm a physician who has done some advocacy for people inside, including Mrs. Laborde's son. One of my questions is, why doesn't a person inside have the right to tell the medical people a HIPAA consent for talking to someone outside? Because when they get sick and they can't go to visiting rooms and they can't get to the phone, there is no communication and no one will talk with anybody. There's no information. The family is completely cut off. There's so much anxiety and worry. Why wouldn't that right exist for a prisoner?
As far as I know, it does. We represent prisoners and get the HIPAA form filled out, and once we do, we are often talking to the doctors at the facility, and we're provided all their medical records, and so we've never had an issue with that. So.
But you did it through being the lawyers.
Well,
That's where we've had to go. And then you have to get a lawyer to get the HIPAA consent, and the records go to the lawyer, and then it's sort of like, why can't a family find out any information?
I think you should be able to. I don't think we rely on the fact that we're lawyers to get it. We send in the HIPAA consent, it's signed, and then they talk to us. So we don't...
The HIPAA thing has confused an awful lot of lay people, non-medical people. And a lot of times there's a hesitancy on the part of a non-medical person to give medical information to anybody, even though he may have signed a HIPAA form. But very often the HIPAA form is signed and they'll designate one person, maybe mom. But when uncle calls, by law, I can't talk to that uncle about it. So my experience has been that HIPAA is too restrictive. But the reality is, and it goes back to staffing or whatnot, your question would be easily answered if each medical unit had an ombudsman who dealt only with the medical issue with the family. But you've got to change the HIPAA laws a little bit to expand it for the incarcerated people, because it's too complicated, and you've got to make it broad enough that somebody from the staff could talk without without being litigated for violating HIPAA laws. So it goes both ways.
Hi. Hi, I'm sorry. My name is Nina Saxon. I'm representing New York City Comptroller's Office, Scott Stringer, and I have two questions. One question is, and maybe you answered this already, I had to step out. How much does the city spend on seniors that are incarcerated in the city? That's one. And then two, demographically, how many men versus women seniors are actually still incarcerated?
You've got those numbers.
I do not have those,
city, but-
not for the city, yeah. But what was sorry, and the second question, could you repeat the second question? It was,
The second question is basically women versus men. How many, or if any, women versus men that are seniors that are incarcerated?
Oh, in New York,
in New York City?
the city's probably very close to New York, the state. So in the state system, you've got 14.8% of the women are 50 and over, 17% are men. I suspect that in Rikers, it's probably very close to it, maybe even more, because you've got a lot of people who haven't even been sentenced. So I would go with those figures. You're talking 17, 18%, give or take.
Good morning, everybody. Stanley Richards from the Fortune Society. Liz, a number of years ago, you were part of a leadership team that, and Brian, you was in corrections at this time, that put together sort of a listening tour for new commissioners and commissioners who served, where they came to New York City and they went and visited some of the programs where they were releasing people to. And that was such a great initiative. We've seen a lot of long-termers after that visit start being released. I think, Larry, you were one of them who came to us after that visit. What can we do to engage DOC, engage the governor's office to have something like that be institutionalized, where new appointments to the commissioner, part of their responsibility is to go around and visit programs so they understand that there are community supports for people who are long-termers coming to the community, and so that they're just not weighing the risk, but they're understanding the community
Can I
supports.
offer an alternative? Don't send you can send the commissioners, that's fine. Send the parole board officials.
That's what.
Yes, that's what we're talking about.
That's what
Parole
really-
commissioners,
yes.
right? You're
Parole
talking about
commissioners.
parole commissioners?
Yes.
Parole committee, you're absolutely right. Plus, Joanne Page and I have been talking a lot. One of the things that has always been problematic is even for the parole board is they might be willing to send somebody out on medical parole if they had a good place to go. And obviously, you know, your place, Fortune Society's taking people like that. We don't have enough community-sponsored nonprofits ready to take the medically infirmed, if you would, medically paroled. And that's a whole nother area, but that's what we got to do. You've got to convince people that it's worth the while, and there's some public safety involved in sending them to a place like Fortune or Osborne or something.
Brian, there's some states, Connecticut and I think Georgia, among others, recognizing that it's hard to put ex-felons in private nursing homes, have constructed, in essence, public nursing homes on state ground, which are operating as nursing homes, not as prisons. The people are not prisoners anymore, and this has been one of the ways to get provide care and treatment for people who don't have family or nursing homes to go to. Has New York explored that possibility?
Not really. Once you start talking about state-run institutions, even though it's nursing homes,
No, they're not state-run. The state owns the property. It contracts out with a vendor, a private, nursing home operator who has to take ex-felons. Can't say, sorry, I don't want you because you're a felon. And runs the nursing home, but it's on state property, which gets around some of the problems. But it's
there's been a lot of talk about it. Unfortunately, it started with sex offenders. Should the state have a place for sex offenders on state property? We have talked to Dr. Shore, Department of Health, about it. And some people have come to us about it. If we could get a contract agency willing to establish and build or find a site, you're suggesting, though, that the site should be on the grounds of the prison, which would make it a little bit easier.
It doesn't have to be on the prison, just on state grounds.
State-owned property. I think if someone came forward, The question will become finances. Who's going to pay for it? And could they make a living? Could they make a profit from it? And that kind of situation.
You're housing these people anyway. You're paying for it anyway. Why not pay for it in a nursing home, which is cheaper and respects the dignity of those who are ill and dying more so than a prison?
Well, then you're talking politics versus logic.
Are you talking about people who are paroled, or you're talking about while incarcerated?
I'm talking about people who aren't paroled,
Are on,
who are medically paroled or would be, but they have no place to go. You might check out what Connecticut has done, and I believe Georgia, because many nursing homes, private, won't take ex-felons. So you have no place to send them if they don't have family on parole. But
Karen.
if the state operated or owned and let someone else operate a nursing home that would have to take ex-felons, you could remove them, grant them medical parole, or just get them out of the prison system. They don't belong.
Karen, have you seen medical paroles denied because there's nowhere to go, or are they just being denied even when they have a place to go?
We see both. We had a case last year where docs had certified our client 4 times for medical parole. He was completely paralyzed. And every time he went before the parole board denied him parole. And one of those times, we were reading the transcript, and one of the parole board members said, and we see here that Dr. Koenigsman from DOCS has certified you for medical parole, but he's not a real doctor, which he is. And I sent that over to Brian, and I think they made a phone call to parole. But so we have seen people that just don't get medically paroled, and we're working on a case right now where our client was given medical parole in February 14th on Valentine's Day, this past February, but he hasn't been released yet because they cannot find a place to put him.
Can I say something about this? Oh, no. I'm going to say something that's going to get myself in trouble, probably a little conservative. So one of the things I find, the critiques from the left of I get into these arguments with people all the time about, oh, you're throwing people into the street, with these conditional parole kind of, and I find this, so one, typically these are voluntary, you choose to go under, sort of some of these, like in Louisiana, that's how it's structured. So I just find this a very odd situation where you're now sort of saying, this person has made, you want when the decision to be fully informed to explain to them what life is going to look like once they get released. But I find this a very strange position to sort of, so they're making this voluntary decision, and you're somehow saying, no, trust me, things are better for you here than on the outside. And it's like, I put my economy, no, they made the decision. They think that they're better off. You're telling them they're not. And so I just find that critique from the left of conditional voluntary parole to be an odd one. And I actually find that I tend to make a more conservative, no, they make the decision, and I'm happy as long as it's fully informed. I'd rather they not be in prison than be in prison.
My name is Joseph Jazz Hayden. I'm with the campaign to end the new Jim Crow. As I sat here listening to this panel, I didn't hear one word about prisoners are human beings. They are human beings in cages. And with the exception of Larry White, all I'm hearing here is how we can tweak the system to make it better. This system is invalid. It comes out of the dark ages, the medieval period in Europe. What we're doing to human beings in cages here, and especially with this aging issue, is we need to step outside the box, man. What are we doing with people, human beings, with parents, grandparents, kids, grandkids? They're connected. They're not there. They not just represent themselves. You say, well, we take him to the hospital and he should be on a furlough. A furlough? He should be free. He should be free. And we have to begin to start stepping outside the box when we have these discussions, man, because these discussions are not beneficial to anybody.
Jazz, do you have a question?
Yes, the question is, why is this conversation reduced to cost-benefit analysis?
So
Instead of the humanity of the people who are in these cages.
everybody on this panel would have rather been on the second panel where we get to talk about why we should not have these folks in prison. And as I started out with about people being human beings who should not be infantilized because of their age, I think Brian's point about there being a number of people who are there, that it would be unfair to the issue not to have a conversation, although we question why people should be there, to not have a conversation about the conditions under which people who are there are there. And that's...
My question really has to be framed in the terms of policy issues. And one of the panelists has talked a lot about the length of sentences. And I hear there are 119 people who are 25 years to life. Is that correct? Life without, thank you, life without the possibility of parole, which is why I'm raising this policy question. What has been going on across the country is a lot of discussion about eliminating the death penalty. And many people say when you eliminate the death penalty and give people life without parole, it creates a situation where there are people who have nothing, quote, nothing to lose. And the panelists talked about the length of sentences. So if there are people who are imprisoned for life without parole, and we are looking now to change policies so that there are shorter sentences, I'm wondering whether or not that conversation, those two conversations are going to come together, and it's going to have a negative impact on what we're trying to do in terms of overturning death sentences as harsh and sentencing that should not take place. That's one question that I'd like people to comment on. The other is the cost shifting. Since the state spends so much money housing people who should be in the community, since many of the people are going back to communities that are already burdened and don't have places for them, whether there can be some exploration of things that can be done to take part of the money that would have been spent if they'd stayed in prison and have cheaper alternatives using electronics and other things if they think they can't be paroled completely or released completely.
Well, I think that anytime you have a situation where, you know, the counter to the death penalty is we need something. We need to have, I mean, that's the argument. If we don't have the death penalty, then we need something where people, perfect time, you know, to punish them and have them have something to lose. But once again, I think it's an issue of public education, a culture shift, an understanding that even the concept of life without parole is a silly concept when you, from a penological standpoint. When you think about recidivism, you think about how people age out of criminality. We don't need it. We have to change the way we talk about criminal justice. So I do think it's a big piece of the education of the public to understand that you can have a sentence that is not a death penalty or life without parole, and it still means something. But it takes a lot. It takes a whole, you know, social science piece. It takes criminologists. It takes people at docs, our legislators, to understand that. And I forgot what your second question was. Oh, I mean, you know, Absolutely. The figure I looked at, over $600 million a year to keep our elderly incarcerated. I don't see why, is there any reason at all that if docs saved that money by releasing the people, that money wouldn't go back into the communities? It would make absolute sense, which means it probably would not be done.
I'm an intern here with Dr. Pamela Valera, right? I've also been doing some work with the Bronx Reentry Task Force, right? And I've heard on this same subject with Sophia Elijah, right? And my question to Lawrence, that's her name, right? Lawrence, right? This is the thing. I know when guys get sentenced, right, for whatever crime, right, they're sentenced because of the nature of their crime, right? So when they go to the parole board, like I heard you mention that 25 years later, you got all these programs and whatever, and you went to the parole board and they still hit you with like for the nature of your crime. I'm just like really, really confused. Why are they able to continue to hit you with the nature of your crime after all of these? And I know that sometimes guys when they first start their bids that they're asked to bring all of these programs. Some of these guys, they ASAC and drug programs and they're asked to bring these programs, and after they go to the parole board, they still hit them with the nature of their crimes. And even at the beginning, when they're sentenced, they're hit with the nature of their crimes, which makes totally like no sense to me. And the other part of that question is, so what is the solution to all of this? What are we to do about this? Because I'm asking this because I have a cousin that's go to the parole board after doing 25 years next year. So I would hate. We've been waiting. Just like I got a lot of family members in and out of the prison.
Let me go straight to it.
All right.
The parole board does it because the law says they can do it. So it's not the parole board, it's the legislators who passed that law. There was a time when the parole board didn't do that. Seriousness of the crime belongs to the judge. He determines your sentence based on the nature of the crime. However, they had some changes in the 70s that allowed the parole board to set the minimum, so they allowed them to do that. So it's really the legislature that needs to change that. The problem is that we have a sentencing scheme that we're not following. The parole board does not act in isolation. It's not an agency untied to itself. Whether the parole board does a good job or not will depend upon what the court does or what the prison system does. But they act separate from those three. Their purview is not to step on other two's feet.
Sorry, I know our time is up, but you did give the microphone to someone else, so.
It'll be a very quick question, I promise. We've talked about the cost and the expense of keeping people in for such a long time. That money doesn't disappear. Who's benefiting from this? Where's the economic windfall?
Well, it's supposed to be the state tax. I wanted to hit on that question before that because we do a lot with Justin. It's a trade-off, right? When you're trying to get something passed. I hate to think of it in such a sort of goal-oriented frame, but the minute you start talking about reinforcement, you start to lose people that you're trying to convince. So it's a really tricky kind of thing that we struggle with a lot. When we're approaching different of course, that's typically that's why I'd love it to be reinvested. But the minute you start doing that, you can lose people, and I think the argument would be is it goes back to the state taxpayer, and right. Yeah, that's the argument.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, please join me in thanking our panel. Brian Fischer, Karen Murtagh, Larry White, Liz Gaynes.